Well, the scenes that we're seeing today from Cairo, the authorities clearing the sit-ins of the Muslim Brotherhood in two central locations in the city, are obviously shocking, but I think it's not surprising that they've happened. Egypt has been a deeply polarized country since at least the end of last year, when the president Mohamed Morsi, who came from the Muslim Brotherhood, tried to drive through a new constitution that created great opposition. And since then, there's been a sense that a big crisis was coming, tension mounting, dissatisfaction with his government. And that culminated, of course, in early July, when the military stepped in and removed Morsi. Morsi was a democratically elected president. He was chosen in the first free election that presidential election that Egyptians had ever really experienced. When the army removed him, certainly a coup in the sense that the army stepped in to depose a democratically elected leader, there was massive support for that. And that's the part of the complexity of looking at Egypt today, a country that is profoundly divided. And we're seeing the consequences of that and the terrible scenes live on television from Rabaa al-Adawiyah, the site of the main Muslim Brotherhood sit-in today. And clearly it's a terrible moment for Egypt. I think that today we're going to see Western governments, the United States in particular, but also Britain and the EU, really put on the spot. They basically acquiesced in the overthrow of Morsi last month. For the Americans, there's a particular problem. The US supports Egypt, and particularly the Egyptian military, to the tune of something like $1.5 billion a year. They're a significant and important regional ally. But it also failed, as have the EU and Britain and others, I think, to use sufficiently strong language to condemn what is by any yardstick the excessive use of state violence against protesters. Now, I think Western governments, whatever their political and strategic calculations about Egypt, the United States, the EU, Britain, are going to have to be much more forceful in their condemnation of this this kind of violence. The Muslim Brotherhood has not been involved in large-scale violence for many decades. It's true that in confrontations with the Egyptian security forces, it's not been entirely passive, but I think it would be quite wrong to portray it, as the Egyptian authorities quite often do, as in some way involved in terrorism. But there's clearly a danger, a real danger, when having gained power through the ballot box, whatever the circumstances, and it finds it being removed and suppressed and subject to the same sort of campaigns of repression that it used to be in the Mubarak years, then people will say, well, what's the point of continuing like this? And there is a risk that people will want to turn to violence. Now, that won't necessarily involve the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole, but there's a whole spectrum of groups in Egypt that are much more ambiguous about violence and certainly have a violent past. There are groups with links to global jihad who in the past fought under the banner of not a million miles even from Al-Qaeda. The larger question, I think, is whether the Muslim Brotherhood itself, which has been committed to parliamentary politics and democratic change, will abandon that strategy in the face of this. It is possible that the movement may split, for example, into different wings. There's already some sign of generational differences. The movement as a whole was committed to gaining power through the ballot box. It did that. It didn't exercise power very well, and it certainly didn't make itself very popular. But in the face of such relentless violence from the Egyptian state, there must be concern that Egypt is heading for serious trouble. The Egyptian army is the most important single player in Egyptian political life. That's been the case for many decades. It's obviously unhappy with the idea of ruling the country directly, because the moment that Morsi had gone, within 24 hours, it had installed a new interim civilian president and a government. It likes to give the impression of being operating only behind the scenes, but there's no question that its power is still extremely significant. But I think that it's getting to the point where clearly when every few weeks a large-scale massacre takes place, that is clearly not sustainable. By dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood through this narrow security lens, if you like, they're not showing themselves capable of delivering a political solution to Egypt's crisis, which, after all, is now very, very urgently needed.